and I'm really delighted to introduce Fay Johnson. Fay is currently Senior Principal Product Manager with LinkedIn's Trust team, but she's had extensive experience on trust and safety teams at Nextdoor, X, went back when it was Twitter, and Meta, in addition to starting multiple pro-social and tech initiatives. I encourage you to check out her bio, but we're here today to talk about one of those initiatives, which she launched last year with collaborators while a fellow at Berkman Klein's Applied Social Media Lab. And as I told Faye, and I've told countless other people, when I first came across Clear Sky, the app, I got about as like geeky and giddy as possible. It was almost like somebody had just took a handful of Pro-Social Design Network's core principles and all the things we love and kind of packaged it into one fantastic evidence-based design with agency, promoting healthy interactions, using federated internet, just a cornucopia of wonderful things wrapped up in one. So you can imagine how excited I am to finally get to meet, actually, no, I'm meeting her for the first day and talk to Faye. So welcome, Faye. And just to start off, since before we get too deep into the weeds, for those here who haven't had a chance to check out Clear Sky, could you just give us some of the basics? So what is it and what does it do?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Julia. Hi, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to chat on this Thursday morning. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. Actually, when I started off my fellowship at Harvard, the Pro-Social Design Network was one of the first websites we were all discussing as a place where we're like, here, what are some of the interventions we're sort of seeing, and really love and appreciate the sort of aggregate sort of collection of tests and things people are trying and nudging for, because it's a really valuable resource. So thank you for the work that you do and the investment that you make in making the internet a better place. So as you said, Julia, I started Clear Sky last year. Clear Sky is essentially a civility overlay for Bluesky. We decided to build it on Bluesky, which for those who sort of follow internet pops around things, Bluesky was a project at Twitter when Twitter was Twitter, and was a sort of spin out that became its own company sort of before the acquisition. And so Clear Sky is an overlay to that platform that is, a middleware sort of layer that allows people to log in with their existing Bluesky accounts and get an additional sort of updated composer window that has some different functionalities in it. Essentially, we're bringing something that is commonly used in the trust and safety space, which is using machine learning and models to do classification of content. And we bring that classification, in this case, we're using Google's Perspective API to make visible essentially a UI that sort of changes as you type. It gives you an indication of how civil or toxic your content is. I've gotten some feedback that the word civil can have a lot of different sort of cultural nuances and perspectives that may even have sort of racial or historical undertones. That's not the intent. The intent here is to be that essentially Perspective API, the way it was built, is that it is essentially a score that gives you a sense of out of 10 people, how many are people likely to be offended. And although that is not a perfect sort of structure, and companies tend to use things that are a little bit more complex, like bringing in hate speech or violence or sort of things that we know are sort of intended to shift behavior in a bad direction, to sort of inform content moderation more broadly. This was an attempt to essentially test out if you're able to bring up some scores that are available publicly, give people visibility to those. And we do this in the form of a weather score. So you get a sense it actually gets more stormy the closer you get to 10 out of 10 people potentially being offended, and then offers an AI-based rewrite of what you're typing in the sort of composer window, which obviously you can edit before you post, but it gives you the ability to both keep the perspective of what you are trying to get across while also getting a little feedback as the author. So it's sort of bringing that feedback signal to the person who's obviously opting in. This isn't applied to anybody without them choosing to participate in it. And the idea is to give people a little bit more of a score to have a more civil discourse online. And I can talk about all the sort of elements of it, how we decided to build it and why we decided to build it. But the nice thing about Bluesky is it's an open source protocol, which allows us to create a sort of a custom experience for people without breaking any of the company's terms of service.
Uh, Fantastic. So yeah, so let's dig a little deeper. And actually, I'm really interested in, and you touched on a little bit like what inspired this. So I'm heard already that it's drawing on a lot of practices already. Yes, but
Mhm.
what really drew this to be? I think the main project that you took on at Berkman.
Yeah, so a little bit about my background. I've spent about 20 years working on trying to keep people safe at scale and sort of navigating complex systems to do that. And I started off my career in human rights research, and working on genocide prevention and human rights abuse work, and then ended up doing my graduate work at Georgetown in behavior change and behavioral communication because I was really interested in how do we actually shift behavior. And then that work sort of took me into working on anti-human trafficking initiatives that were anchored around technology platforms and engaging consumers. And ultimately, I ended up moving into trust and safety on the product management side because I thought it was a really interesting and unique opportunity to try and shift behavior and keep people safe online at scale. I think it's 5.3 billion people who use social media on a regular basis. That's an average of more than 2 hours a day per person. And so it's definitely a forum where a very large percentage of the world's population is interacting. And so how we design systems, how we design interfaces, how we guide people to the type of interactions they're having online is both a big risk and a really big opportunity about how we foster the kind of communities we want to see and the kind of relationships we want to see. And when I had an opportunity to go to Berkman, what I was really excited about was to test some things that I had seen as potential levers or opportunities when I was working at really large social media companies. I worked in Meta's Central Integrity team, which was a team responsible for content moderation, account security, governance. I built Facebook's oversight board. I was in charge of the teams that helped manage the reporting flows and the ability to call out content that you saw that was harmful on the platform. And one of the things that we saw in these spaces and experienced a lot is that often people think that they don't understand how content moderation happens. It feels like a black box. There's a lot of pushback to the idea of like, why did my content get taken down? I was just trying to make a point. There are a lot of critiques that content moderation can often be political, or people who maybe don't have access to the inside dashboards and the labeling to understand what the data actually looks like from the outside. There can be a perception or an argument that it is political in nature, or that there is a worldview being used to determine what stays up and what comes down when it comes to content moderation. And I can't disclose the information from the companies I've worked at, but I will say that there really isn't a bias from a political perspective when it comes to stuff, but there is a sort of standard norm about what is allowed and not allowed. At least historically at the companies when I was working there, there's been a little bit of a shift over the last couple of years about what companies are deciding to allow or not allow. Obviously, when Twitter moved to become X, there was also a shift in how much the new owners chose to reinforce or not apply the policies that were in place previously. But the idea generally was there was a sort of a standardized norms, but that often wasn't visible to people. And so we've sort of tested at these companies nudges, Instagram and Twitter did initiatives around nudging better behavior, sort of saying, hey, you may want to think about this. They saw about a 15% reduction in those tests of harmful content being posted. At Nextdoor, we had a kindness reminder where we had something where if people were about to post something, so we sort of do analysis in the composer and be like, hey, you may want to think about, remember to be kind on the platform. And there were also things when you were walking into potentially a heated debate, we would also send you reminders just to participate in a civil way. At Nextdoor, we were able to do that through classification of things like if we had seen a bunch of reports on a particular conversation thread, say it had been flagged as potentially political, or people were arguing, or there was a lot of words or verbiage in there that had been sort of hashed as aggressive or um, hate speech adjacent or unpleasant things, we would just say, hey, you're entering a heated conversation. Think about how you want to contribute, or if you want to contribute to this conversation thread. And with that, we actually saw a reduction in the volume of sometimes engagement as well, because people weren't sort of jumping on the bandwagon, but also a reduction in the total volume of harmful or sort of hurtful posts that were being, or comments that were being made. So having seen all of those things, I thought, what would it look like if we brought some of that to the user slash the composer, the person who's the author, the person writing the content, and give them an option to say, do they want to adjust their own speech? And it may be idealistic, but my sort of hope was that you give people an opportunity to get that feedback themselves so they can choose. You can still say anything, you can still make any point, you can still argue for a case of anything on any side of an argument, but how do you do that in a way that is polite, respectful, a way that you can engage in a way that actually encourages good dialogue on both sides or of at many sides of a particular issue, and making those classifiers the kind of thing that I would not be surprised if it modeled the kind of things that Bluesky may on their trust and safety team decide to take down. So essentially, how do you make sure your point gets across without being taken down on a platform? We can make that visible to people and see how they use it to be empowered. The other thing that I was really excited about being able to try with Clear Sky is that the AI assistant is trained in nonviolent communication and the idea of perspective taking of the other people or the person you're responding to. So it works best if you're in a comment thread or if you're responding to a person, it will sort of read the context of the post above it and say, oh, Julia, I see that you, to give a next door example, are feeling really upset about people leaving their trash cans in this street. I can appreciate that it might be blocking your parking spot. My perspective is that is my public space in my driveway, and I view that I should be able to leave my trash cans out until things close. I haven't got home from work. This is a very mild example, but there's a lot of discussion about trash cans on Nextdoor. But the ability to sort of take that perspective, and what we train it on is reflecting back the perspective, finding common ground and acknowledging the person's feelings. And then the idea would be that you ask a question or invite some dialogue. And wouldn't it be great if we all, of all 5.3 billion people on the planet, had maybe gone to therapy, had those tools in their thing, had really worked on bridging communication? It's not a really reasonable expectation. It doesn't also work in every context. Sometimes you just want to be able to be funny or make your point in a more strong way. But the opportunity to see how something gets rewritten is a good tool from an educational perspective in mirroring, even if you end up rewriting or changing it, being able to hear how you potentially could reframe something is a really valuable tool people have in both educational environments, therapy environments, um, workshops on nonviolent communication, being able to be like, oh, I could frame it this way. And so I try to put quite a few things into this to sort of see how we could use it as both an educational tool and to encourage more sort of civil discourse online. But those were sort of the things that went into my thinking about why we built Clear Sky the way we did.
I love that. And you've added one other thing that it hadn't occurred to me, which is another kind of pro-social design principle we have um, is some of people call it boosting. So it's not just like nudging behavior, but it's kind of it's building people's capacity to have healthy interaction. So I hadn't realized that there was that educational component to that, that we're kind of learning how to speak with each other. And I really wish I could use it for my co-ops listserv, which is I'm I'm trying to formulate a way to interject into a not very pro-social dialogue that's happening at the moment. So you mentioned middleware, and one of the things that that's really exciting about this is that it's not just platforms interjecting these kinds of tools, but giving individuals the ability to add it on to and include it in their experience. And so middleware is something we're excited about. So now I kind of want to turn to what you learned in the rollout. And because this is a new animal where you're asking people to
Hmm.
voluntarily take on this
Hmm.
tool. What have you learned in the process, and really how can it help inform future projects that are similar to Clear Sky?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple learnings. And I think there are certain things that our group is sort of hoping is an outcome of the sort of Clear Sky project. I think one learning is um, people don't really like AI. There's a lot of, some people do, but I would say globally there's a lot of sensitivity, a lot of fear, a lot of concern about how AI is used. Those of us who've been working in trust and safety for a long time have been working with machine learning models for a very long time, not necessarily in a generative AI capacity, obviously, because that is sort of a newer skill that is being developed, but we've been using machine learning to do pattern recognition. You can't moderate 2.3 billion people's content without using some pattern recognition and working on training models. So that's something that's really common, but there's a lot of sort of resistance to the idea of AI being used for anything. And I think finding a way to bridge that kind, where is it helpful, where is it not, I think is helpful. And then just sort of having a dialogue about how people feel about those things. Some folks have been said Perspective API, which is the tone and classifier that we used as the backend for Clear Sky, was developed by Google. There's obviously questions about how is that trained, who is participating in that, how inclusive is the perspective on what people may or may not think is toxic in the toxicity classifier. So I think that's always an important thing to consider. And I think if we were trying to do this at scale, really having a thoughtful and open source model that maybe you were able to do checks and balances of, so people felt like the model itself was not reinforcing any sort of social biases or discriminations, would be really valuable. Obviously, as a fellowship project where we don't have any financial backing, we didn't have the ability to develop a whole model on our own that was sort of trained on all these things. But I think that would be something, if we had funding, would be a really cool thing to be able to explore. Is just like, how do we even do the classification in a way that's open source? People can be making sure that the model is representative of a variety of perspectives when determining what sort of where we're getting to on a toxicity perspective. I think adoption of something like this is hard. I think that's one of the challenges with middleware across the board, is that unless you have really high awareness, if there isn't a desire to opt in, you're not going to get as much adoption. I think we've had somewhere between, I was making some notes, like something close to like 40,000 people who have used Clear Sky, but it's not an active base at that level. So it's one of those things where I'm like, having worked on platforms where there's billions of people, that's a really small number. But it is great to get people's feedback on the project as a whole. I think one of the downsides of something like this, if it's not already embedded in the platform, is that you're asking people to opt into having a tool to sort of help them with their interactions. But the folks, it's selection, there's an issue of selection bias. So the folks who are interested in having more civil discourse may choose to use this tool. The folks whose content who most likely might be taken down may not be the same people who are inclined to use a tool like this, right? So it's sort of this question about, are you even getting it in the hands of the folks who are the most frequent flyers, which we and trust and safety, the ones people's content gets flagged and taken down on a more regular basis. And so that's a little bit of a downside of having a project like this where people are opting in. The folks that need to opt in may not actually need the tool. They may have a lot of sunny content versus things that are on the stormier side. And then I also saw a question here in the comments about, do people feel like they are being sort of talked to by a bot? And I think the thing that is valuable about the approach we've taken is that you're not having a conversation with a agentic agent, you're not having a conversation with a bot, you are simply getting like a rewrite assistant, think about it, and then you can still edit it, right? So you can say, oh, it doesn't really sound like me, I want to change this thing, and it should be reflective of your tone. There's obviously tweaking that can be done to make sure that the tone and your sort of personality continues to come through. We've done some tweaks on the prompts to try and get to an improved outcome there, but the intention is to make it so that you're still feeling like you're talking to a real person, because it's not you edit it, you choose what you publish, right? So this is something it's still your voice. You could have something stormy, and if you get to the point where it's like the sort of the highest weather report on the stormy side will pop up again, saying like, hey, are you sure you want to publish this? But you still get to post whatever you want. So we don't sort of while it might be a built-in nudge you choose to opt into, we are not sort of suppressing speech, which I know is a concern for some people.
Well, fantastic. And I see there are questions in the Q&A, so I think we're going to wrap up and move to the Q&A session. So I'll stop
Of
recording.
course.